All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into a massive legal showdown, one that literally put an entire nation's tax law on trial.
So what happens when a brand new major tax law gets put on trial from day one? We're about to find out. We're looking at the intense legal battle over the Philippines VAT Reform Act. Now, this law was a huge deal. It was designed to pull the country out of a serious financial crisis. But the second it was passed, it got challenged and sent straight to the Supreme Court. So here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with the law going on trial, then dig into the challenges against Congress's power. We'll ask who really holds the power, look at a big question of fairness, hear from a really powerful dissenting voice, and then the final verdict.
All right, first up, a law on trial. Let's dive into how this whole thing landed in the Supreme Court in the first place.
Okay, Section 2, challenging Congress's power. And this is a big one. The question on everyone's mind was, did the lawmakers go too far? So the argument from the petitioners was pretty straightforward. They said, hey, the Senate totally hijacked this bill. The original bill was about VAT, but the Senate tacked on amendments about income and excise taxes. They argued this broke the rule that all revenue bills have to start in the House. But the court, they saw it differently. They said, look, the bill has to originate in the House, not the final law. As long as the Senate's amendments were, germane, related to the bill's main goal, which was raising money, then it was all good. The Senate was just doing its job.
Now for Section 3, who holds the power? This is where we get into a really tricky legal concept called undue delegation. So, what was the big deal? Well, the law had this little thing called a standby authority. It basically gave the president the power to hike the VAT rate from 10% to 12% starting in 2006 if certain economic targets were met. The challengers went nuts over this. They said, no way, that's Congress's job. You can't just hand over the power to raise taxes to the president. But the Supreme Court, they broke it down step by step and came to a totally different conclusion. They said, hang on, let's look at how this actually works. First, Congress sets the rules, the specific conditions for the tax increase. Then, the Secretary of Finance just collects the data. They're basically a fact checker. If the numbers match up, they tell the president. And finally, the president's role is just to execute the law that Congress already wrote. They're not making a new law, they're just flipping the switch that Congress built. And this is really the key takeaway from the court's ruling on this point. They drew a very clear line in the sand. They said Congress didn't delegate the power to tax. That's lawmaking. They delegated the power to implement the law. The decision, the intent and will to raise the rate to 12%, that came from Congress. And that, the court said, is perfectly fine. Okay, moving on to Section 4, a question of fairness. Now, we're about to get a little technical here, but stick with me because this part of the case had huge, real-world consequences. We're talking about the battle over input VAT credits. So first things first, what the heck is input VAT? Well, think of it like this. It's basically a tax credit for businesses. When a company buys its supplies, raw materials, whatever, it pays VAT on those purchases. Later, it can claim that tax back as a credit to offset the VAT it collects from its own customers. The whole point is to avoid taxing the same item over and over again as it moves down the supply chain. Okay, so you got that? Good. Because here's where it gets controversial. The new law came in and said, whoa, hold on. You can only claim back up to 70% of your output VAT in credits each quarter. This was a huge deal. It meant businesses might not get all their money back right away. And as you can imagine, that started a massive fight. And this really gets to the heart of the disagreement. The petitioners were furious. They said, this is our money. It's a property right. You can't just limit it like this. That's taking property without due process. But the court, wow, they came back with a game-changing argument. They said an input VAT credit is not a property right. It's a statutory privilege. In other words, it's a benefit that the law created. And because the law created it, the law can also limit it. Big difference. And on top of that, the court kind of threw a bit of shade. They pointed out that the law hadn't even gone into effect yet. So all these claims of financial ruin, they called them conjectural or merely anticipatory. Essentially, they were saying, this is all just theory. Come back and talk to us when there's actual substantial controversy, not just something you think might happen. But the decision wasn't unanimous. And that brings us to Section 5, a powerful dissent. One justice, Justice Tinga, had a very, very different take on all this. And honestly, his dissenting opinion was just incredibly forceful.
He wrote, and I quote, "I do not share the majority's penchant for awaiting the blood spurts before taking action, even when the knife's edge already dangles." Wow. I mean, what a line. He was basically saying the court shouldn't wait for disaster to strike before protecting people from a law that poses a clear and present danger. He directly pushed back on the idea that the harm was just theoretical. He argued that you could do the math right then and there and see that the 70% cap would cause real, tangible losses. It wasn't guesswork, it was a mathematical certainty. For him, this wasn't turning a credit into a slightly smaller credit, it was turning it into an actual loss. And what's so interesting is that he made it clear this wasn't some niche issue. He pointed out the sheer number of major business groups that were sounding the alarm: the Chamber of Commerce, foreign chambers, industry federations, even accountants. The entire business community was basically screaming that this was a bad idea. So that brings us to the end. Section 6, the final verdict. Despite that powerful dissent, the majority opinion held firm, and the court delivered its final order.
And it was decisive. The motions were denied, and that's it, with finality. The Supreme Court declared the VAT Reform Act constitutional, and they lifted the temporary restraining order that had been preventing it from taking effect. The law was now live. The fight was over. But this whole case leaves us with a really fundamental question, one that goes to the very heart of what a court's role is. When should a court step in to protect people? Should it act as a shield, defending citizens from potential harm before it happens? Or does it have to wait for the damage to be done, and only then act as a sword? It's a debate that's still very much alive today.